So I've been shooting with the brand new Sony 70-200 f4 Macro G OSS version 2 lens for the last month or so, basically ever since it came out. I didn't actually pre-order the lens, but I bought it very, very soon after it came out, and I've shot quite a few projects with it. And so today what I want to do is just kind of give you guys my initial impressions on this lens after using it for the last month. Now, before we dive into all the details and stuff, I do want to say this is not going to be a super in-depth technical review. This is going to be a much more hands-on, practical, first impressions review of this lens. So if you're looking for technical review, there's plenty of other channels that have those kind of videos out there. But what I want to do is just kind of share my thoughts on using this lens for quite a few jobs over the last month, and just kind of my first impressions of this lens, how I found it fit into my workflow, and honestly, hopefully whether or not it's right for you. Hopefully this will kind of give you a little bit better idea of this lens as a whole, how it actually performs in the real world, and yeah, hopefully you guys find this video interesting. So let's go ahead and dive in. So first off, let's talk about why I actually purchased this lens. Now, the short answer is I purchased this lens because I only had one lens for my Sony FX3 and I needed a telephoto. If you've been following the channel for the past few months, you'll know that I recently added the Sony FX3 to my arsenal. I'm primarily a Canon user, but I added the Sony FX3 combined with the Sigma 24-70 art lens, and I've been using that to film my YouTube videos, to film reels and shorts, and then also for some commercial and brand projects that I've been doing. I've been filming all of those on the Sony FX3 with the Sigma 24-70. But the problem was with that setup is I didn't have any telephoto lenses. And so when this lens came out, it was super appealing. One, because it was a cheap telephoto lens, but then two, because this lens is incredibly, incredibly versatile. Not only is it a fantastic focal range, 70-200 is a great focal range for any kind of telephoto work, but this lens also has a great macro capability. Now, I don't want to dive into the weeds of is this actually a one-to-one macro lens and all that. I said this is not going to be a technical review, but whether or not you want to call it a macro lens, this lens undeniably has a very close focusing distance, even zoomed all the way in at 200 millimeters. And so for someone like me who only really had one lens on my Sony kit, I really wanted to have a telephoto lens, but I also wanted to have a macro lens, and this lens checked both of those boxes for me. And then one more super appealing thing about this lens is just the size and weight of it. It's funny because if you actually hold this lens up to my coffee mug, this lens is really not that much bigger than the coffee cup that I carry around with me everywhere, and honestly, it's not even that much heavier. And so for someone like me who's traveling a lot on planes and in cars and all that kind of thing, and someone who's traveling with Canon gear and those lenses as well, it's really nice to have a very small but competent telephoto lens that can also double as a macro lens and really just rounds out my kit on the Sony FX3. So that's why I bought it. Let's chat initial impressions. And right out of the gate, I just want to say the image quality that comes out of this lens is fantastic. Over the last month, I've filmed a wedding, I filmed a 2-day project for a school, I filmed some reels for some other brands as well as for myself, and I filmed a YouTube video using this lens, and I've been really, really happy with the quality of this lens. I've even used this lens on my FX3 for some photos, and honestly, the images coming out of this lens paired on the FX3 have been such high quality, I would never have guessed they were only 12 megapixel images, and I've been really, really happy with the image quality coming out of this lens. I've also been able to put the macro capability of this lens through its paces, and honestly, I gotta say, I'm really impressed. Now, I will say as a caveat here, I have noticed I haven't been able to get quite as close to a subject as I would with like a proper macro lens, like my Canon 100 macro or my Nikon 105 macro back in the day when I was shooting Nikon. I could definitely get a little bit closer to my subject with those lenses, but to be able to get within a few inches of a subject when I'm zoomed in all the way to 200 millimeters has been more than adequate for anything I've needed to shoot personally. And it's been a lifesaver, specifically with weddings and when I'm filming details here in the studio. Just being able to punch in really, really close, get really, really tight details, and then in the context of a wedding, be able to go from detail shooting straight into like a 200 millimeter long shot of somebody like walking down an aisle or something like that. It's been really, really awesome to have that versatility in this lens. Another thing I did some testing on was just the different stabilization modes on this camera. So this lens has built-in optical steady shot, is I think the Sony version for it, but basically image stabilization built into the lens. And this lens actually has 3 different modes that you can use for the image stabilization. Now, for someone who's coming from Canon, I had no idea what these modes actually meant, but I did some research, and basically mode number 1 is just kind of an overall stabilization mode for the lens. It'll kind of help compensate for vertical and horizontal movement. Mode number 2 is specifically built for panning shots. So thinking sports work where you might be panning very, very quickly back and forth between players or cars driving or something like that. And then mode number 3 is really all about erratic movements. And I think that could also be applicable in sports situations, but also shooting wildlife and specifically birds that might have very erratic flight patterns. That's where that mode number 3 might come in handy. And I've been really impressed with the stabilization here. I'll throw some clips on the screen just to kind of give you a feel for what this looks like. Basically, I just went out to the park and I was standing holding the lens and I was just kind of like doing some micro jitters with my hands, kind of wobbling the camera back and forth, shaking it a little bit. And you'll see as I turn the image stabilization on and off, there's a very, very massive difference that actually happens when you start actually using the stabilization that's built into the lens. And then the final thing to mention about this lens is the ability to have full-time direct manual focus. Basically, this is just a little switch on the side of the lens here that you can toggle on and off. But basically what this does is allow you to manually override the autofocus of your camera, even if your autofocus is actively working in the middle of a shot. And so you can kind of set up a shot, let the autofocus catch focus, and then you can override that just by moving the focus control on the lens. It'll automatically override all the stuff that's happening in the camera until you stop moving the focus ring, and then the camera will go back to autofocus again. It's just really nice to be able to have that option, and I just appreciate Sony putting that on this lens. So is this lens for you, and should you pick it up if you're interested in it? Honestly, I think it's a phenomenal lens, and I've been really, really happy with it. And for the price point, you really can't beat it. The cost difference between this lens and the equivalent 2.8 version lens, which also doesn't have macro capabilities in it, is pretty phenomenal. And combine that with the fact that it's so small and so light, it's a really, really attractive lens as a whole. Now, a reason you might not want to consider this lens is if you really need the f2.8, if you really need the extra stop, and sometimes you do, or you really need that extra depth of field, and sometimes you do, yeah, it could be worth spending the extra money to buy the 2.8 version. And so are there going to be people that absolutely need that lens versus this one here? Absolutely, but I think as an all-arounder, great telephoto lens with some really close focusing capabilities, really great image stabilization options, fantastic image quality, and a great price point, I think this lens is honestly a huge win and a fantastic all-arounder telephoto lens from Sony. So anyway, that's my thoughts on the new Sony 7200 f4 Macro version 2 lens. If you guys have used this lens, I would love to hear about that in the comments. Let me know your thoughts. And if you're interested in purchasing this lens, I will leave a link in the description. That's an affiliate link that'll give me a little bit of kickback, and I would greatly appreciate that. Thank you guys so much for watching the video, and I will see you in the next one. Peace. Also, I moved my office around again. This is the third time I've done this. I literally started on this wall over here, and then I was facing the window, and I just got tired of squinting when I was trying to edit, and so I moved over to the other wall, and now we're trying a new setup. Hope you guys like it. We'll see how this works. I might end up back on that other wall again, but I think for now, I'm pretty happy with this. All right, cheers, guys.